Hi, I'm Liz and welcome back to my channel, Creating Inner Beauty. I'm here today with my first VR to the tag Decks for Decades. And I first saw this tag on Dawn Michelle's channel, Boho Tarot. And I believe, my understanding is that it was a tag that was started by Jessica Starr, the Story Witch. And basically it consists of choosing decks in our tarot deck collections that represent each decade of our life. And I think it was something that Jessica Starr, the Story Witch, did for her birthday. And it was recently my birthday. My birthday was on May 21st. Today it's June 3rd, so a little over a week ago, maybe almost 2 weeks. But I turned 40, so that was fun. Still trying to figure out how I feel about that. But I thought it would be really fun to go through my collection and talk about how I see my tarot decks in relation to the decades of my life. I also wanted to mention that I watched a really fun video from the channel 3 Fat Readers, which is a collaboration channel between Lisa Papez, Danny Mystic, and Dustin from Modern Metaphysicae. And I really enjoyed their discussion around the decks that they chose for each decade of their lives, and it at some point brought me to tears, and I resonated with a lot of things that were discussed in the video. So that's another great video to check out if you're interested in this tag, and I'll try to leave all of these channels linked down below as well. So for my decks, I have a very small tarot collection. It's nothing too exciting, but I did think it was kind of fun to go through it and think about how each deck symbolized the different times of my life. So I have chosen just tarot. There's no oracle, although I feel like I could do a whole other video with the oracle decks. And I chose 2 tarot for each decade just because why limit myself? So let's start with 0 to 10. And I think that this actually might be kind of surprising for some people, but the first deck I want to talk about in regard to that time of my life is actually the traditional Rider-Waite. This is my very first tarot deck. I've etched it in this like kind of aqua sort of color, teal color. And while I don't think I actually got this deck before age 10, the reason that I chose it for that time frame is that even as a child, like a very young child, you know, I would say like 2nd and 3rd grade. So what is that, like 8 or 9 years old? I was in the adult section of the library checking out the metaphysical section, like checking out books on how to develop your psychic abilities, checking out books on mediumship, checking out books on ESP. That was definitely like a title that came up a lot, or like an acronym that came up a lot in that section. Looking at the occult, definitely saw books about tarot that I looked into at that time. So I was pretty familiar and immediately interested in that kind of stuff. There was a couple other topics, and that may come to play later as I discuss the decks that go with each decade. But there are basically 3 topics in my childhood that I was obsessed with. Metaphysical, anything of a metaphysical nature, ancient Egypt. I'm half Egyptian, but I don't necessarily feel like that came from my direct cultural experience, but more just fascination with the history and mythology of ancient Egypt. And by extension, specifically the time period where Cleopatra reigned, but all of it. And then was always obsessed with any kind of like beauty, skincare, self-care sort of topic, even like under 10 years old. So those were the books I would check out from the library, besides any like fictional stories that I would read. And I was a pretty advanced reader, so I probably got into some things that maybe I shouldn't have at that time, but hey, I'm still fine. Okay, so that's why this is one of the decks that is representative of my first decade of life, 0 to 10. And I know everybody's already seen the traditional Rider-Waite, so I'm not going to spend too long showing you the cards, but this was my my choice for that. And then I also felt like I wanted to do a little aspect of that period of my childhood by showing the Crystal Unicorn Tarot. Like, while I wasn't specifically into unicorns at that time, in addition to my interest in the metaphysical, I was very much a child who loved stories, who loved magic, who loved fantasy, who was just very into that sort of world, like a fantasy world where the good guys always win or love always prevails, where magic can make everything right, that sort of thing. I'm still that way to this day, I'm not gonna lie. But I feel like this deck, the Crystal Unicorn deck, has that same energy of like innocence and playfulness and magic that was also part of my first decade of life experience. So those are the backs, and it's also the traditional Rider-Waite, but interpreted through these adorable unicorn images. And so it's a really easy read once you're familiar with the Rider-Waite Tarot, but it's so cute. So I think that that's super fun. Yeah, and my childhood definitely wasn't always super light necessarily, but there was a part of me that always went to those things as a source of solace and inspiration and comfort. So I feel like this deck sort of holds that energy of that. Okay, so that was 0 to 10. Now, let's go to 11 to 20-ish. So there are 2 decks I chose for that as well. Now, similar to my traditional Rider-Waite, like my interest in these topics has continued on into my teenage years. And as a teenager, I felt like I got a little bit more into thinking about witchcraft, Wicca, not just studying and learning about spirituality, but maybe how it could apply to my own life or what my own practices would be. Also, somewhere in there, I started to actually like study tarot more specifically. Not in a super intense way, but definitely I would like pick up books and read about it and do some journaling, etc. And it was also that time period that I discovered that the traditional Rider-Waite wasn't the only tarot deck that there was. And I don't love like the coloring of the first version that I had. So then I got introduced to the Universal Waite, which has a slightly different tone and coloring to it. And I decided to pick up a version of this to sort of be my like study deck. And it was just kind of nice knowing that I had options. And I'm sure there were other decks at the time too. So this would have been like early 90s, I guess. And so I'm sure there were definitely other ones, but I kind of stuck with the Rider-Waite as the one I was learning primarily, but just like having another color option was nice. Okay, and then it had these backs, which I like better than the plaid back of my very first tarot deck. So this is sort of just representation of my continued interest, but making it more my own thing and something that resonated with me aesthetically as well. Now, the second deck I chose to represent that period of time in my life was the Modern Witch Tarot. And clearly this deck was not around at that time, but I wish it was. Like, I think having something like this would have been really interesting as a teenager. Probably when I was like 16, 17, 18, I was reading books about Wicca and witchcraft and understanding all of that, spellcraft, etc. And I didn't necessarily do a lot with it, but it was something that like deeply resonated with me, and also very much getting into looking at more earth-based spiritualities in general, learning about the Wheel of the Year, learning about different world mythologies and pantheons, gods and goddesses, etc. So, and figuring out how, if and how I wanted to incorporate those things into my life and my personal practice. So I feel like the Modern Witch Tarot is just like a really fun interpretation of that period of time for me, and something I wish I had at the time. So those are the backs. And in these cards, it's still the like traditional Rider-Waite symbolism, but now starting to be interpreted through a more modern, feminine, diverse, empowered sort of way. And then, at that time, thinking about how to incorporate these very, very, very old teachings into modern life was something that was interesting to me. And I also like, that the figures in this interpretation of the tarot are like dressed in a modern way. They're kind of cute. They have like, trendy clothing on. Like this girl has like a long sleeve crop top on, that kind of thing. That was like so me as a teenager, definitely, into fashion, into clothing, into makeup, but also into like the metaphysical, esoteric, occult studies. Okay, so I thought that was kind of fun for that period of time. Okay, and then now let's go into age 21 to 30. Now for me, this time period of my life was maybe a little different than some other people. I actually have kind of an unusual educational background. So I went to college pretty early and also went to grad school pretty early in my life. And specifically in college, I studied psychology, and then I went to grad school for clinical psychology. I have a PhD in clinical psychology. So that period of time in my life was actually really focused on intense study of the human mind and behavior and emotions. And although I'm not specifically Jungian in practice, at least when I was practicing therapy, I wasn't, definitely Jung's theories resonated with me, and his integration of spirituality into psychology and his thinking about a lot of sort of metaphysical topics, but in relation to how individual psyches functioned, was something that was really interesting to me. So I thought that the Insight Tarot was a really good representation, because this deck is all about using Jungian archetypes in the interpretation of the tarot. These are the backs. And I haven't spent a ton of time yet with this deck, and it is kind of pippish, but the guidebook is really interesting and really talks about some of the tarot concepts in relation to Jungian theory. And so I thought that was a really good representation for that time period of my life, because I spent 5 years in pretty intense study with that. Simultaneously, my interest and knowledge of mythology and metaphysics and all those other topics I was interested in also culminated in me exploring a lot of goddess spirituality. And I actually ended up writing my doctoral dissertation on looking at how women conceptualize their idea of the divine in terms of gender. So whether or not how women, I'm trying to think of how I phrased it when I wrote the title, that's why I'm pausing. The title was Gender Conceptualizations of the Divine in relation to women's feminist identity and self-esteem. So basically what I was looking at is, do you see a divine figure in your life that is male, female, or non-gendered, or encompassing all gender? So the results of the study are like not important because it's so old now, and just even like the concept I was using are sort of outdated and not very modern. But through that process, I did a lot of exploration of feminist spirituality and goddess spirituality. That is my point that I'm getting into, and developed a much closer relationship with the goddess. And that became a big part of my personal practice, and it remains a big part of my personal practice as well. So, getting to the point, the Pocket Goddess Tarot is the tarot deck that I chose to represent that aspect of my 20s. And I only have the pocket size version of this deck. I know there is a normal size version, but I only picked up the pocket one. Sorry, my cards are all over the place. I'm just trying to fix them. Okay, but it's actually really handy to have a deck this size. And I remember another reason I chose this deck is that after I graduated, which was basically in my mid-20s, and started my first job, and through my training, I took this deck to work with me, and every morning I would do a little card pull with this deck because it was really easy to keep in my desk or in my purse, and I would do it in the morning before I started seeing clients. And so that was a way I incorporated tarot into my daily life at that time, as well as my goddess spirituality. So those are the backs. And with this deck, each major is a different goddess. This is, they call it balance in this deck, but I believe it's temperance, and it's Yamanya. It does have female figures in the different minors. I'm trying to find another major card. Judgment is Guinevere. So it just uses different goddess or other feminine archetypes for all of the major cards, and then there's a lot of feminine figures in the minors as well. Okay, very good. Heading down the home stretch here. So for this most recent decade, I would say, so where am I at now? 31 to 40. Saying 40 is weird. I'm going to tell you that. I'm going to talk about my Moonchild Tarot and the Lightsabers Tarot. So I would say in my late 20s and then going into my early 30s, it was a very work-focused time. I was doing a lot of clinical work at the time, still kind of kept up some of my interest in tarot and metaphysical topics, but the focus was much more my clinical work. And then I'd say in my late 20s and early 30s, I definitely had some really challenging things go on in my interpersonal life. So those things really kind of began to break apart the structure of my life, and it was a lot of tower moments at that age. And so I started to kind of put together and think about what was really interesting to me, what really resonated with me. I felt like I needed to put down some of the clinical work I was doing because it was getting very heavy, and move into some lighter things. So during that time period, I moved from doing clinical work in psychology to opening my own business, which was a bar exercise studio, and which is something I really love doing as well. And I've done probably for the last almost 20 years. So I was still working in the wellness field, but it was a little bit more physically based and a little bit lighter, but it was still about helping the majority women, but people overall, create strength within themselves and empower themselves and move confidently in the world, which is really important to me. And it also kicked off a much deeper exploration of my own spiritual gifts, which has culminated in, within literally the last 2 weeks, me selling my exercise studio to some of my wonderful employees so that they can carry on what we've started there, and moving more full-time into doing intuitive work, energy healing, and intuitive coaching, which is kind of where I'm at with my personal process right now. But I will get to the decks in a second, I promise. But a huge part of this last decade of my life has been connecting more, as I said, more deeply to my gifts. A couple years ago, so I must have been 37 or 38, I went on a sort of pilgrimage, goddess spiritual retreat to Egypt, and started to connect to not only the mythology and the history, but more deeply with the energy of the goddesses. So that's represented by the Moonchild Tarot for me. And it definitely has a lot of Egyptian symbolism. You can see the cartouches there. But represented in this very, this way that feels less historical and more connecting with these very high vibrational energies, as well as a lot of strong divine feminine images. So I really resonate with that. And just how aesthetically beautiful this deck is. I think I mentioned early on that one of my very first interests as a child was beauty in general, and self-care and makeup and pampering and making things around me beautiful. I am on the Taurus Gemini cusp, and I'm hugely Taurus. So I think that that's kind of part of the draw for me. So this deck speaks to the culmination of all of my interests and all of the things I love. I won't belabor that point because I feel like I've said that a couple times, but that is why I think it makes a really good representation of my 30s till today. And also it's the first indie deck I bought. And during this decade was when I discovered YouTube in general, first makeup YouTube, which is awesome, and then TarotTube, which is amazing. Just YouTube for everything. YouTube is amazing. Okay, and then last deck I just wanted to mention was my Lightsabers Tarot. And the reason I chose this deck was because it's the one I've most often been using in client readings, and reading for other people is something that has developed within this last decade of my life, and something I'm really excited and passionate about. And reading for other people, I've spent all that time in my life interested in tarot and coming back to it at different times, and interested in metaphysics and connecting with spirit and opening my spiritual gifts, and etc. And it always felt like something that was super interesting to me, but I couldn't quite figure out how to fully connect with it. And I found that when I can't read tarot for myself, for example. I mean, I can, but it feels very superficial in a way. I can get a little taste of connecting to spirit and my intuition with it, but it's when I'm reading for other people and connecting both to their energy and then the energy of the divine that I feel in flow, and I feel like I am accessing a different like part of myself and a different state of consciousness and a different realm in a way that kind of has pulled everything together for me. So anyway, my point is that the Lightsabers Tarot represents me reading for other people, which I feel like has really allowed me to develop my own gifts and is a part of the work that I really would like to continue doing moving forward, and that I do now as a part of my job, which is super fun. And it's so interesting to me because I find that when I'm reading tarot, I'm doing what I did when I was doing therapy in my 20s, when I was meeting with clients, but the energy is coming from the universe and from a higher source and not from my personal energy. So I can share what's coming through and help someone with their healing process and to talk things out and to make movement and change in a way that feels so much lighter to me and is so much quicker and more immediately effective, and it just blows my mind. And it blows my mind how everything has come together and how like all the things I was interested in as a child have like come together to be what I would like to continue to do for the rest of my life. So so fascinating how it works out. And it really makes me think, like, you know, that of the idea that we come to each incarnation with like our purpose inside of us, and we just kind of have to either not forget it or come back to it on the way, and that everything we do kind of comes together ultimately in the best possible way if we let it. Anyway, that's a topic for a whole other video. But anyway, those were my decks for decades. I hope I didn't ramble in too many different directions, but I definitely got excited about this tag and wanted to share some things with you. Please let me know what you think, what you know, tarot decks resonate with you, and I'd love to watch more tags about this. I hope other people also do this tag. I'm sure they will, and I'll be keeping a lookout for those. And I hope you have a wonderful week.